Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Hesh, and I will be taking you through the webinar, which is about protecting content in the age of generative AI. It's a very sort of timely issue that a lot of publishers and rights holders are experiencing. And the goal of today is really to walk you through some solutions that are being used. Also, what does the future of this ecosystem look like, given that it's changing at a very sort of rapid pace as well. So without further ado, yeah, let's begin. So so we're going to be covering a couple of things. We're going to be talking about essentially what the objectives are. I'll start off with a brief introduction about Valyu, what Valyu is doing, also my sort of background, and all the research work that we have been doing in these areas. Then we'll kind of walk you through some sort of protective measures. Now, a lot of the sort of taxonomies that we kind of talk about and how we structure this is something that we have been kind of working internally, and it's something we use internally in terms of our own positioning, etc. So we use these mental models because they help us understand this a lot more sort of at a much more sort of structured and deeper level, and that is one of the intentions as you guys also kind of take something from these mental models that we've developed. Some of them being, active and passive measures to protect content. We'll dive deeper into what are some active measures, what do they look like. Then we'll spend the bulk of our time in passive measures, what they are. And then we'll kind of go into consent and talk particularly about opt-out, especially because all this sort of stuff that's happened, especially in the UK with opt-out and where this ecosystem's headed with respect to opt-out. And then we'll kind of touch briefly upon crawling as well, how it came about and what's the sort of next evolution iteration in this space and what it means, not just for rights holders, but also for AI developers as well. There are a number of sort of objectives that I want to get out of this webinar. Again, just to reiterate, we are doing webinars every month, roughly around mid every month. And the goal is to kind of introduce concepts and kind of introduce the space, all the work that's been done, and how to go about thinking about navigating this growing ecosystem when it comes to consent, licensing, data, AI, all these things. And this is just one of the sort of webinars. I believe it's the second webinar that we're doing. And yeah, the objective is to introduce some sort of protective measures that are being used and essentially how to go about thinking about them, and kind of discuss, as I said, consent in detail, but also kind of in general motivate the need for better mechanisms and how to go about thinking about them as well, and how that also is also impacting some sort of policy measures as well in this area. Before I continue, a bit about ourselves. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Valyu, where we're building a platform to help rights holders license and distribute content to an ecosystem of AI companies, not just for training, but all across the spectrum to context enrichment as well, which is another way of saying, things like retrieval augmented generation as well. We, as a company, believe that content distributions evolved from print and film, it evolved to the web, and now it's moving into context windows and print models. And the idea being that how do we actually help AI developers get access to high quality data, but also rights holders be in control and monetize this data as well. Just going to turn this off. Ooh. There you go. One key aspect about us is we have been thinking about a lot of these problems from first principles for a very, very long time. I've done a couple of postdocs at UCL, still lead some research work there. The same is true for the other sort of founders of Valyu as well. We're a bunch of researchers in the ML space. We've written papers in programmatic consent, machine learning, valuation, all the sort of related fields, and that's informing a lot of the stuff that we do. in terms of how we go build a platform, but also how to think about, things like standardization, etc., from a technical perspective, but also from a much more wider perspective as well. So that's a bit about our background, and I'll now kind of go more into essentially protection and protective measures. So the way we like to think of protective measures is there's two kinds when it comes to your content and it being used for AI training or context enrichment. The first kind is what we say, or the first family is more active measures, and the other is passive. Active essentially is anything that's more sort of explicit or direct that you as a rights holder uses to disrupt the use or access to your data for training or context enrichment. It could mean, poisoning your sort of data sets or kind of doing explicit measures like bot blocking, etc. But it's more sort of on your side to kind of block the access. Passive is indirect in the sense that you are uh, signaling a usage preference on your data and you leave it to the AI developers or the ecosystem to kind of act accordingly. Now you could kind of have some sort of enforcement on this, but it's not as explicit as active. And that's how we think of the two. We'll briefly cover both of these and some mechanisms being used in practice today. As I said, active is essentially direct interventions. The critical bit being that you as a rights holder is the one that's preventing either the access to the usage of your data by AI systems, be it for training or enriching context or anything, or even just for agents to use it. And there's a number of techniques that are out there. The first family of techniques is what we call adversarial techniques. These essentially are ways to kind of corrupt your data or kind of poison your content in a way that's invisible to the human eye. But it's adversarial to AI models or bots in the sense that they might kind of find something that's gibberish, or they just won't be able to read it, or they might get something different out of it. This is a very sort of active technique to kind of use. And some of the limitations include, it's a very point solution. So it does a really, really good job of protecting your content, especially images. But they're point solutions in the sense that they only work for specific use cases within specific boundary conditions. So it's not something that scales, especially if models are continuously being updated and new training techniques are being used. It's not something that you can actively use. Wherever it's used in point solutions for protecting some certain kinds of data, which are very, very sensitive. So it lends itself really well. But for more sort of generalized use cases, it's not used. A good example of this is Nightshade, and I'll kind of go into a bit more detail about what Nightshade is and how it kind of achieves protection. Another common one is, let's just kind of block access to our data by AI crawling bots and how they kind of use it. So essentially, bot blocking is the kind of go-to mechanism in terms of active measures. Um, Going back to the adversarial technique, as I mentioned, one such technique is something called Nightshade, and it works actually, it's designed for images and it works very well with images. What it says or what it does, it says, hey, you know what? I've got a bunch of images that I don't want people or AI companies to train models on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to poison these images. So what the left-hand side of the slide shows is a bunch of poisoned images. What it's done is it's added some sort of noise within this image. Again, it's not perceptible to the human eye. As you can tell, they're pretty much the same pictures. But to an AI model, um, it causes a very sort of vast sort of difference in it. And once it's trained on a number of sort of images that are poisoned, it starts to kind of uh, kind of uh, kind of impede its ability to learn the representations on the image. We'll take one such example. So over here, essentially there was a clean model, but it was trained on a number of you could say poisoned images. And what happened was, after being trained on 50 samples, it started to kind of skew or distort the outputs. So initially it was kind of giving an output of a dog really clearly. After about 100 poison samples, it started to kind of give what looks like a cat, but it doesn't look like a cat. But training it on more sort of poison samples kind of tricked the whole model into kind of spitting out an image of something completely different. It's the same thing over here. It tricked the model once it was trained on this poison data to kind of spit out an image that was completely different. And that's essentially what a technique like Nightshade does. It just perturbs the images and poisons them so that the model kind of ends up being misled. The paper, I think it's by a bunch of researchers from the University of Chicago. They kind of introduced this. It's a great paper. I'd really kind of recommend everyone to kind of read through this. As I mentioned, adversarial techniques such as these, they work really, really well, but they only work well for a given set of constraints. Now, what's happened with each and every sort of a new family of models is just the fact that they are generalizing so well. It's almost as if now they can actually look through a lot of this. So these sets of techniques are becoming less and less sort of useful with newer generations of models. Another sort of active measure is the use of, you could say, bot blocking and analytics. And the idea being that you want to kind of go and see which bots are kind of accessing your websites, for what purposes and how it goes about doing it. And then maybe once you're informed enough, you could kind of do something about this. What we're going to do is walk you through a tool that we've actually built for our clients, which is rights holders, which includes a number of sort of publishing, large-scale publishers and publishing houses. I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm just going to bring this here, and you should be able to just bear with me. Yep. So you should be able to see my screen properly. Just bear with me. Cool. So this is our bot blocking or bot analytics tool that we have, and the key being that we want to kind of inform you about who's accessing your content, for what purposes, etc. Now, this is a sort of a global sort of traffic that we have on a small sort of user of ours on a small scale. And we're just going to see what the sort of real-time traffic is when it comes to just bots versus sort of humans. Okay, so I've hit refresh and I can see across the globe, you've got some red bots that are, agents or sort of bots, and blue are sort of actual users. You can see there's some SEO bots, you've got sort of search index bots. But things do get more interesting this side of the globe, which is let's see over here. Ooh, you can see ChatGPT is being accessing this website a few times. Is there anyone else? Okay, there's Bing. There is Feedly, which is an intelligence gatherer. Again, what we've done is kind of classified all these bots by families, and what we'll show you is the sort of bot access for a given period of a year. So from December 27th, we can see that when it comes to AI data crawlers, etc., let's see a data crawler, you can see it's been accessed 200 times. 32 times, etc. So the idea is to guide you to understand how much traffic you're sort of losing to bots and what and how exactly they're behaving. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Alex to just ping ChatGPT to see whether it's actually kind of pinging this website or not, and seeing the bot actually behaving. Think let's just give it a couple of minutes. Alex, he's just sitting across me, so he's going to just make sure that he's pinged it via ChatGPT. I'm going to hit refresh. There you go. So you can see that once ChatGPT was hit, it went and kind of went through this website and kind of gathered, you know, accessed the data and literally accessed the website. And then you can see all the stuff that all the pages it's going through, and we've classed different families of crawlers. You know, there's some that are doing search, they're doing some are just using it for training data. There's some agents, they're SEO crawlers. So the idea is to really sort of guide you and help you understand how your data is actually being used. In how it's being used by AI bots. Moving on from this sort of bot analytics, once you know about what sort of bots are sort of targeting your sort of website and domain, the next step would obviously be to kind of do something about it, and that's the step that we're now sort of working towards. Is there any way we can do any sort of blocking or any way to kind of push them forwards and go to some other sort of redirect them to a paid for service or similar. So that's another active measure, bot blocking and analytics. We're now going to go more into sort of passive measures. Now, passive measures, as I said, are different in the sense that they rely on signaling the usage preference. Essentially, you as a rights holder are kind of conveying or communicating a preference. Hey, you know what? I don't want my data to be used for X, Y, Z, or hey, you know what? I want my data or content to be used for X, Y, Z. And the expectation is that the AI developer will kind of respect these. Either they're kind of forced to respect it by means of regulation, or it's more a politeness thing. That's left to be kind of determined as regulations go on. But this is just the mechanism that's used is one that relies on consent and usage preferences. Um, as I mentioned, it relies on communication. It's instrumental. Consent is a key aspect of it, and it kind of has this element that it assumes compliance from those that are using this sort of data or the content to kind of respect it. As I mentioned, consent is key in that it's very sort of key, almost like a primitive in how passive measures work, because that's the only or one of the few that is arguably the only mechanism through which you're signaling the preferences that you have and communicating it. Which kind of brings me to the much more sort of wider part of the debate, which is, hey, you know, you've got consent, but which one is it? Is it opt-in consent or is it opt-out consent? Like, how are we going to be thinking about this? Which one's the right one to use? Which one isn't? And we'll now kind of spend the next 10, 15 minutes kind of really walking through different sort of consent mechanisms, you know, the sort of trade-offs that they have and how they work as well, and kind of deeply look into opt-out as well. As for the sort of debate about, you know, opt-in, opt-out, I'll leave that to later part of this presentation. But in opt-in, essentially what you're signaling as a rights holder is, hey, you know what? You can only use XYZ bits of content from my website, which means you as a rights holder are essentially saying proactively that, you know what, I only want certain parts of my website, maybe certain images or maybe certain pages to be used. And the key bit is that explicitly granting access. It the way I like to think of it is it's an additive form of consent rather than a subtractive form of consent. As for opt-out, essentially assumes that the entire web is up for you know, being used by AI models or agents, unless you as a rights holder has said, you know what, don't kind of use my sort of website for training or context enrichment purposes. Again, the key being that the rights holder has to signal this explicitly. There is this element of it being implied in the sense that everything is or can be used for training unless explicit sort of consent has been kind of signaled that you can't do this essentially. Um, we'll kind of briefly talk about how consent or what we need to kind of have in terms of a good consent infrastructure to kind of enable all of this. Now, as I mentioned previously, that consent is a very sort of key primitive, and everything hinges upon consent and capturing it and doing it at scale. So we have to really start thinking about what a good sort of consent mechanism looks like, a consent management mechanism looks like. At a high level, there's 5 components that we think of when it comes to consent. The first being that you want to capture the consent, then you want to do 2 things. The first one is communicate this consent to an AI developer, either this data is free, well, this data is okay to be used for training or context enrichment or for what purpose. Then there's the element of sort of bookkeeping as well, where you're actually kind of explicitly saying, or the AI company or yourself is actually kind of keeping a system of record of saying, hey, you know what can you actually use and what can you not use? And the reason why bookkeeping is often overlooked, and in my opinion, a very sort of subtle element of this whole thing, but very crucial, is because that's the one that kind of holds everyone accountable in all of this. Then obviously once you've kind of got the record, you want to kind of monitor and then potentially do some sort of enforcement on these bits of consent. So these are the sort of building blocks of any sort of consent management system. So the key point that I'm trying to make here is that regardless of it being opt-in or opt-out, any sort of system that is built or designed for managing, training data consent will have to have these components, irrespective of opt-in or opt-out. The only distinction being made over here is in how the bookkeeping is done and who does the bookkeeping. What I mean by this is, as I mentioned, in opt-in, it's more sort of additive bookkeeping. You're actually keeping a system of records for what bits of content can be used and cannot be used, or can be used, sorry. Whereas the opt-out way of doing things is, it's more subtractive in the sense that everything can be used except for all the stuff in this record. Now, as the web kind of grows in, content, especially in the next few years, there's going to be a tsunami of, content, especially generative content. It's going to become more and more sort of firstly important, managing and conveying preferences and doing this bookkeeping. But we have to kind of come to almost a better way, a more sort of programmatic way of kind of managing these books of consent. One thing I will highlight in all of this, especially consent, is a really nice exemplar that we're all sort of familiar with. And that exemplar is in sort of data privacy or personal data privacy. From 2017 or 18 forwards, what we had after GDPR was, you go to every website, you get some sort of consent with kind of signaling your preferences, which are then kind of kept by the webmaster, that is then kind of used. But the reason why I kind of mention GDPR as an exemplar or as an example is because, in my opinion, GDPR in terms of managing consent, it's been brilliant, but it almost feels like a bolted on solution when it comes to consent. The fact that we all have to go to a website, and every time we hit a website, the first thing we get is a massive pop-up saying, you need to kind of signal your preferences. hold on a minute, I've kind of signaled this to one website, two websites. Why don't you just go and kind of generalize what my consent preferences are across all the sort of websites? So, these are all the sort of UX sort of decisions that need to be made, especially because there's a new class of users coming onto the web, which is AI agents and AI applications. And they're going to behave a lot more. They're going to behave a lot more at scale than humans. And the idea is, can we build something that actually accommodates this iteration of the web or not? And if so, what does that look like? So all this stuff needs to be thought about when we start thinking about implementing consent and systems that allow rights holders to do this and do this at scale as well. Um, which kind of naturally leads me to the kind of question of, hey, you know what, opt-in versus opt-out, which is the best way? Arguably, there is no best way in this, and a lot of the sort of debate is still ongoing from a regulatory perspective, but also as engineers and people that kind of implement these standardization protocols, like which is the best way. And ultimately, there is a lot of sort of trade-offs that we have to kind of think about making. And some of the trade-offs that I want you to think about are pretty much on how each one kind of goes about solving, achieving what it needs to, and what sort of balances we need to think about. As I mentioned, opt-in provides, as a rights holder, you've got more control. But for from a bookkeeping perspective, what it means is that you will have to kind of make sure that you are keeping a record of each and every bit of content that's being kind of created and curated. A much more sort of simpler way of thinking about this is, you know what, let me just keep a subtractive book, which is all the stuff is allowed except for A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that can be actually used for training. Now, it's a lot more simpler to implement, especially when you start thinking about, the web kind of exploding in terms of the amount of content. But it does also assume that, you've got the infrastructure to kind of do this, and, the monitoring, etc., is there as well. So these are sort of trade-offs that you'd really need to start thinking, we really need to start thinking about. Um, a bit more about the sort of opt-out form of managing consent. We're already seeing that happen a lot, and there's a bunch of sort of regulations or bills that are coming along that are suggesting that, what, opt-out may be one sort of way or the way to do it. Now, it's still very unclear which one's going to be the one that pans out, but there's a lot more sort of lean towards the opt-out way of doing. Um, we don't have any sort of recommendations about which one's better or for worse, because it's still a very nascent space. But we are of the opinion that, what, opt-out is one such way that could be kind of used at scale, especially given how much the web is going to explode with agents and AI agents and AI systems that need to kind of use the sorts of data sets. Going back to some sort of current approaches, the most sort of widely used one is overloading the robots exclusion protocol, which is, essentially specifying in the robots txt that, hey, you know what, I just want to disallow all the sort of robots of this certain name, or potentially do something that's completely heavy-handed and just block every sort of bot. So essentially, if you're a sort of AI developer that's got a bot that's going and crawling it, assuming that you are kind of respecting, the politeness of it, and you go to a website and see that they've just signaled that they don't want to be kind of scraped, you'd back off. So that's the sort of go-to mechanism that a lot of rights holders have started using. There's a really nice paper by Shane Longpro and a bunch of sort of researchers that kind of have found that, I think, year on year there has been almost a 500% increase in the amount of bots being blocked, or AI bots being blocked. So you can see how many publishers are using this mechanism to kind of disallow AI bots from sort of crawling their sort of content. The other one is more sort of aimed towards metadata levels of restrictions. And the best example I can give you of this is C2PA standards. Again, it's a very sort of early stage sort of standard, so it's not proliferated as much. But the idea being that you're kind of embedding the sort of rules of what you can and cannot do with a given sort of content asset directly or data asset directly into its, metadata file or manifest file. And it's just a lot more easier because then you don't have to worry about the bookkeeping element of it, or at least to a lesser sort of capacity. And the next part is, hey, you know what? All you're doing is kind of putting all your communicating all your preferences directly into a massive sort of do not train, registry. Again, another sort of bookkeeping, a centralized sort of bookkeeping solution where you're just saying, you know what, these are my preferences. I don't want anyone to kind of go and kind of use my data or just use my data for XYZ or use XYZ bits of data. Um, but essentially, you as an AI developer then have to go to this registry and compare that, you know what, I can use this, I cannot use this, for what purposes can I use this? So this is another sort of solution. But the kind of downside or limitation of this is that you're always relying on some sort of centralized body to kind of say or kind of dictate or manage this bookkeeping for you. Again, it's a database that they have to manage, but if it's starts to kind of do bookkeeping of, petabyte scale level data assets or data sets, it becomes a very, very sort of critical part of the internet's infrastructure. And to kind of allow one certain body to do this, firstly, the question is, who's going to be the governance, what's going to be the governance like of such a registry, or who's going to be doing it, or why should they do it? So you've got all these sorts of things to worry about with centralized sort of systems as well. Then there's obviously the aspect of AI companies being respecting or monitoring this as well. So you've got all these sorts of approaches when it comes to operationalizing opt-out consent. We'll kind of briefly talk about robots exclusion, and the key kind of takeaway that I want you guys to have over here is that it's actually, even though it's arguably the most widely used, it's actually not fit for consent. Sorry, it's not fit for purpose in its current iteration, and there's a lot to be done if we are to kind of start using this as one way of kind of managing or communicating consent. Um, just some brief history about how robots TXT actually even started. So it was actually, I think it was in 94. Yeah, it was in 94 when early days of the web. I was actually 1 year. I was about 1 year of age at the time. But yeah, um going back to 1994, there was a Dutch sort of webmaster. I believe it was Martin Koster. And essentially he'd kind of put up a website, and he kind of basic, basically got hit with a lot of bot traffic, and these were, search engine bots, that were just sort of inundating his website. And he was like, is there anything I can do about this? Because this is just gonna increase my hosting costs. And again, it was for a time when, uh, the web had a limitation in the sense that server resources were very limited and expensive. So if a website kept on getting pinged by a lot of, bots, that translated into a lot of, bills or hosting bills, that someone had to kind of take up. So basically he said, hey, you know what, I'm just going to go to a mailing list and kind of talk about, is there a way of doing this? So he ended up designing something called robots not wanted.txt, which was essentially the first iteration of this. And as that sort of community started adopting it, and for the longest of time, search engines adopted it as an informal standard. I think it was back in 2019 that a bunch of a bunch of people from Google actually said, right, you know what, we've been using this almost as a tacit standard, but we just need to make it more so formalized as part of the web standard. So you can imagine from 1994 to 2019, that's quite a long way. But yeah, I think it was Gary Ilias and a bunch of others that kind of created this, formalized this standard, and now it's sort of become a web standard on bots and how they're going to be used. And again, ultimately, it's a politeness protocol that you have to kind of respect, and it's entirely voluntary, and that's one of its key limitations. Um, but going back to the whole debate about, what AI training and, operationalizing opt-out consent, or, just consent in general, is the robots exclusion protocol in its current iteration the best way of doing it? It's not. As I kind of went through the history, like it was never designed for this. The way I like to think of it is that we're asking a common sort of kitchen knife we're using a common kitchen knife to tighten a screw. I mean, sure, in theory it does work, but is it the best tool? It's arguably not. And we need to kind of either shape a better screwdriver from this knife, or kind of get a new knife, sorry, get a new screwdriver to allow us to do this. And that's where we are in this sort of debate. The idea being that we want to kind of repurpose or kind of change such a standard. Now there are a number of standards that have come along. There is AI.txt amongst others, but that's another sort of debate that's ongoing. But more importantly, there is a community and a group of people that are actually doing stuff about it. As I mentioned, robots.txt is not fit for purpose. It was never designed to signal consent. It was built for, indexing efficiency, and not for AI data rights at all. And again, it's not enforceable. And the other bit is that it's very heavy-handed. It just does not specify things like allow my website to be crawled for indexing or web indexing and SEO, but do not use it for AI training, or use it for AI training, but only do images, or only do text, don't do both, or only go and do one page, don't do the other pages. Like, do you see how quickly this whole problem of managing consent explodes. So again, it's not a tool that's actually designed for such things. And we have to realize that we need better ways to do this, or scalable ways to do this. As I mentioned, the web has a new user, and that uses the AI agent. Humans are not just the only sorts of users or active users on the web. We now have another active user, which is the AI application or bot or agent, and we need to kind of also repurpose or kind of build infrastructure on the web that actually enables them to do this responsibly, where rights holders also kind of are respected, but also AI developers can also kind of build value out of it, and can also share this sort of value with the rights holders as well. That sort of concludes my sort of presentation, but one bit I will kind of talk about before I finish is this idea that we need to accept in one capacity that AI bots are here to stay. And I'll give you a very sort of simple motivation for this, which is if you go to any sort of AI application out there, any RAG or LLM application, its architecture is going to look quite similar to what I have over here. Now, it might seem like a very complicated architecture, but I'll kind of walk you through it. So, you've got your AI application, you've got an LLM in the background, it's trained on some data, either kind of scraped, or it kind of is kind of using some sort of proprietary data, but also it's kind of using data on the fly, or doing data retrieval on the fly. Now, all this is becoming part of the workflow of any AI developer. And most AI developers, their sort of go-to is, hey, you know what? I've got this problem. Can I just go to a website and just build a crawler to kind of scrape the data, or kind of crawl it, or whatever. But the point I'm trying to make is AI developers have sort of become used to the idea of, you know what, we're just going to go and crawl it. Now, the question is, how are we going to kind of use this as a way to kind of stop them or kind of enable them to do this responsibly? And that's where the sort of debate is, in our opinion, because this as a workflow is going to be here. So can we make the web, or can we build tools and infrastructure on the web that allows AI developers to do this more responsibly? And essentially, that's what we as a company do is allow, you know, rights holders to kind of license and distribute the data on the web at scale, you know, with the rights of consent and management, but also kind of enable AI developers to kind of work with, you know, consent managed data at scale. And that's pretty much what we do. This concludes the sort of webinar, and what I'm going to spend the next part of this webinar is kind of going through any sort of questions that you may have. Oh, we've got a question. I'm just gonna um oh, so the question is if the robots exclusion protocol is not fit for managing modern data rights, what are some more sustainable alternatives? There's actually two ways to think of this. The first one is um if it's not fit for managing modern data rights, can we actually do something to actually improve it? And I think that is the way to do it, is can we kind of change the standard to accommodate AI bots, agents in training? If so, what does that look like? And I think that is the way of thinking about it, is to kind of iterate over the standard because it's already kind of part and parcel of the web's infrastructure. So that's the way I think of it. Just going to wait for another couple of questions. Couple of more minutes if there's any questions. Right. I don't think we've got any questions. If there's any questions, feel free to kind of drop me a message. The email is hirsch@valyu.network. So it's HIRSH at valyu.network. And I'd be happy to kind of answer any sort of questions that you have. I do kind of appreciate you taking the afternoon to kind of join me on this webinar. Again, this is part of a large series of sort of webinars that we will be doing. Some of them are going to be a lot more technical in content, in terms of more oriented towards AI developers. You know, what to think about things like when it comes to data quality, what to think about when it comes to licensing. How do you speed up the licensing process? What to think about when it comes to licensing and price discovery and all these things. So there's a lot more sort of content that's going to be coming. The intention is to create an entire sort of series of this. And yeah, appreciate you guys taking the time. I hope you guys have a great week, or well, what's remaining of the week as well. So cheers. Thanks everyone. Bye.